You've probably heard this a million times in the business world, right? It's treated like this piece of ancient wisdom, short-term pain for long-term gain. The idea is that great leaders, the really great ones, have to make these tough, sometimes painful decisions today to guarantee a better tomorrow. It sounds smart, it sounds strong, and it's been the reason behind some of the biggest shakeups in corporate history.
But what if it's not really true? What if this celebrated strategy is actually, well, a dangerous myth? Today, we're going to put this core belief under a microscope. We're going to look at the stories, the hard data, and a really surprising clue from the world of medicine. All right, let's dive in.
So to start, you got to understand why this idea is so powerful, so sticky. It's because we see it in the stories of these iconic leaders who took massive, gutsy risks that ended up paying off in a huge way.
Okay, think about this. A moment of, intense pain for a company. When Steve Jobs came back to Apple, he just famously started slashing product lines left and right. People were confused, the company lost money in the short term, but that ruthless focus was the very thing that cleared the path for the iMac, the iPod, and yeah, eventually the iPhone. It's a classic case of short-term pain for legendary long-term gain. And hey, it wasn't just Apple. Over at PepsiCo, Indra Nooyi saw the writing on the wall. The future wasn't only going to be soda and chips. She started pushing the whole company towards healthier stuff, even getting rid of some popular brands. And yeah, sales took a dip at first. That's the pain part. But that move positioned PepsiCo perfectly for a whole new generation of customers.
And the pain part isn't always about chopping things off. For Satya Nadella at Microsoft, it was about a huge, expensive pivot. He moved the company's focus away from its main cash cow, Windows, and bet the farm on the uncertain future of cloud computing with Azure. It took massive investment and a total culture shift, a really painful bet that ultimately made Microsoft one of the most valuable companies on the entire planet.
Okay, so the stories are incredible, right? They're legendary. They form the bedrock of this whole leadership idea. But what happens when we stop looking at these heroic one-offs and start looking at the cold, hard data? What does a 40-year analysis of one of the most common forms of corporate pain, downsizing, actually tell us?
And this is where the story just takes a complete nosedive. The common wisdom, the claim, is that downsizing is a necessary evil for the company's future. But a massive meta-analysis, looking at almost 40 years of research, came to a pretty stunning conclusion. On average, there's actually very little long-term gain to be found, at all.
So what exactly did this massive study find? Well, it was a meta-analysis, which is basically a fancy way of saying they scooped up the results from hundreds of individual studies over 40 years to get one big, super reliable picture of the link between downsizing and, how much money a company makes.
And what's really fascinating is how the reason for downsizing has totally changed over time. Back in the 80s, it was a desperate, last-ditch move. But then in the 90s, it became this cool, proactive strategy. Being lean and mean was all the rage. By the 2000s, though, people started seeing the risks, and it mostly went back to being a defensive, last resort kind of thing.
So what did it all add up to? Well, the data is just crystal clear. This number right here, R equals negative 0.10. It compares companies that downsized to those that didn't. And that little minus sign, that means that, on average, the companies that downsized actually performed worse than the ones that kept their people.
Okay, but wait. What about a company's own performance? I mean, surely downsizing helped them improve their own bottom line over time, right? Well, nope. The data here is even more damning. The link was negative here too. So not only did these companies do worse than their peers, their own financial health tended to get worse in the long run. The gain they were promised? It's just not there in the numbers.
And this leaves us with a giant puzzle, doesn't it? On one hand, you've got these incredible success stories from Jobs, Nooyi, and Nadella. On the other, you have this mountain of data saying it just doesn't work. How can both of these things be true? What's the missing piece that separates the big wins from all the failures?
Well, the answer, believe it or not, might not come from a business school, but from a hospital. A study on how patients recover from major surgery gives us a really powerful clue about that missing ingredient.
So get this. Researchers were studying patients recovering from lung surgery, and they noticed something kind of weird. Some patients, even though they were in pain, got up, did their rehab, and recovered pretty quickly. But other patients with the same amount of pain got scared, avoided moving, and had a really tough recovery. The difference wasn't the pain. It was something else entirely. And that something else was what we call psychological resilience. Basically, it's your ability to adapt when things get tough. It's not about being tough or just gritting your teeth and ignoring the pain.
It's about how well you can process a setback, change what you're doing, and bounce back.
And look at the data from the study. It's pretty striking. You can see right here in the table, psychological resilience had the single biggest impact on reducing a patient's fear of pain. And at the same time, it was the most important factor in improving their actual recovery. Resilience was the key that unlocked the whole short-term pain for long-term recovery thing.
Okay, so let's bring this all the way back to our business puzzle. What if the secret of leaders like Jobs, Noe, and Nadella wasn't just that they were willing to cause pain, but that their organizations, their people, their culture, their systems were already incredibly resilient enough to handle it and bounce back from it?
When you put it all together, the stories, the data, the medical study, it all points to this one single idea. The whole strategy of short-term pain only leads to long-term gain if the organization already has the built-in resilience to recover and grow. Without that resilience, pain, well, it just leads to more pain.
So a resilient organization has these huge advantages. It doesn't just, survive a tough call. It has a culture that reduces fear and drives people to adapt. It is systems that help people learn and grow from a tough time. We're talking about clear communication, a high level of trust, and the ability to pivot fast. That is the resilience that separates Apple's turnaround from the thousands of failed downsizings in the data.
So, maybe we've been asking the wrong question this whole time. Instead of asking leaders if they're tough enough to make painful decisions, maybe we should be asking if they've been wise enough to build the organizational resilience to make those decisions actually pay off. That's the real challenge, isn't it? And maybe the true mark of great long-term leadership.